The English language in India has always been associated with some form of empowerment or the other. This could be an empowerment of the intellectual or the cultural kind, which places you among the native elite in the society. Or it could be a social kind of empowerment which brings with the language the possibility of moving up in the social hierarchy and also opportunities opening themselves out to you because you possess the knowledge of that language. Why has this happened with the English language in India? Obviously, this has nothing to do with the system known as the English language itself. We have to look beyond the linguistic sphere and enter into a discussion of the historical, the sociological factors which made English a language of empowerment ever since it was introduced in India. It came to us as part of the historical intervention known as Western imperialism. Of course, there are any number of instances where the language has reached us even before the empire came here, but it was in a very small way, in small pockets, and it was treated as part of the multilinguistic nature of the Indian society. Let's not forget that when we talk about English or any language in the Indian context, we are talking about a hugely multilingual, multicultural context, very different from what existed or it continues to exist elsewhere outside India. So, even when English had reached the Indian shores and it was known to a small number of people earlier, it became something very important for the entire civil society to discuss when it became very closely aligned with the imperialism. Just as British imperialism went on to consolidate itself, English language began to acquire the kind of power it has been always associated with. This can be treated as a cultural power which is part of the cultural politics, which uh, is introduced in native societies when a colonizing regime begins to rule it. More specifically, in the earlier period of the East India Company here in India, um, there was this um, approach or stance among those who were ruling us, and I mean, who had consolidated their power in most of the pockets in India, that they should not interfere with the languages here or the religions here or the ways of life here. If you look into the biographies and the political biographies of the early um, governor generals in India, you see that their policy was somehow to keep out of these religious, cultural, and linguistic issues, and some of them had a genuine admiration for the long cultural and historical legacy of India. Clive himself, for example. Now, because of this, they felt that if anything has to be done towards the native society, it should be empowering of the vernacular languages. The word vernacular is a colonial word. It referred to what are today known as the bhashas or the regional languages. There was already a system of education in place in India, and the feeling of the administrators was that they need not in any way upset the existing system and they should try to support knowledge and education in the vernacular languages. We should also not forget the fact that um, it was Persian which was the language of administration for a very long time, and most of our Indian elite, including the upper caste Brahmins, not only studied Persian, they brought pressure on the kings and the princes and the local chieftains earlier to start the madrasas where the Persian language could be learned, because that was the language of power earlier. Now, I don't think the earlier phase of British imperialism really had any engagement with bringing about changes in the language of power or the language of administration, and more importantly, the medium of instruction. The issue came up for discussion in England also, when it was a question of financially supporting um, the so-called classical languages of that time, and languages which were associated with knowledge and scholarship, namely Sanskrit and Persian. By then, some of the leading Indians who had benefited from Western education and who knew English and many European languages, they were the ones who made a very strong plea to the British that it should no longer be the vernacular languages which should be the media of instruction in India, it should be English. And the demand was for the colonial modernity which was associated with English. And there was also this perception that English was the repository of all great values, and that's, of course, a part of the imperial project. One can remember here the excellent work done by Gauri Vishwanathan. She pointed out that it was a mask of conquest, the projection of English literature, especially, as a repository of the best knowledge in the world, or English literature as an expression of probably the finest civilization, the most progressive civilization, namely British civilization. It was all part of the legitimization of the imperial rule here. Without going into this very well known territory, I want to come back and take the argument forward. So, when it was a question of granting financial aid to these languages, the British found that there were already very strong Indian voices which were demanding modernity, they were demanding English, they were demanding English as the medium of higher education. Raja Ram Mohan Roy is a very famous individual associated with this demand by the native elite, the educated Indian middle class, the so-called Bhadralok, which wanted to identify itself with what they thought was a global modernity. And that is when we have this discussion, policy making, taking different swerve, and with Bentinck and also Thomas Babington Macaulay, we reach a stage where the British administration decides that the native peoples in India should be given the benefits of the greater, superior British civilization, and this can be done by introducing English literature in the Indian colleges and the universities. This led to the drafting of the famous, and according to some people, infamous minutes of Macaulay, in which he very strongly denounced the existing systems of knowledge and education here in India, and the knowledge which was available in the Sanskrit language, and argued in favor of what was then considered modernity. And this minute became a very coherent plan for the British administration, and in 1835, an official policy decision was adopted to introduce English as the medium of instruction. So there are three things which, in a way, converged together. One is the decision of the British to intervene in the field of language and education in a big way. Their decision to give the benefits of the so called progressive, finer civilization to the native people through English, and then, more importantly, the collaborative effort of the Indians themselves in demanding the introduction of English. We have to come away from the false narrative that English was imposed upon us by the imperial rulers. Much of the excellent research work, starting with Gauri Vishwanathan down to Alok Mukherjee and others, um, this research points out very clearly that this is a constructed narrative that English was imposed upon us. No. The truth is that there was a collaboration between the native elite and the rulers, and therefore, English and English literature were introduced in our educational system, and English gradually replaced Persian as the language of law and the language of administration. In the entire history of India, the repeated pattern is whenever there is a change of regime and change in the language of power and administration and prestige, the native elite here immediately changes its loyalty, and that happened as far as English is concerned. So we have a long history of English education in India. Of course, there are a number of things that one would want to ask about the entire phenomenon. Did it really bring us the European, or at that time what was known as global modernity, or were we exposed only to something much smaller and narrower called colonial modernity? Secondly, how did the teaching of the canonical works, the so called great works of English literature, help in the learning of the English language? Wasn't there a gap between the requirements and the necessities of the regime at that time and the kind of training in English that was given in our colleges and universities? I don't think there is space for entering into all that. What is very clear is that English immediately became a language of empowerment because it assured the Indian elite jobs and opportunities in the expanding administrative system of the British rule here. It also became a prestige language because um, the elite adopted it as the prestige language, and it also was like a cultural capital for many of the Indians here. So, for these three reasons, it was seen as the language of empowerment. If you look into very great historians' writings, for example, the writings of Sumit Sarkar, you will see how the questions of Naukri, employment, and Chakri, and then the effort of the Bhadralok or the middle class to assert itself by learning English, by entering into the system of employment. All these writings very clearly show the phenomenon as it happened here, which led to the empowerment of English during the colonial period. Now, one would expect that this would change with the inception or beginning of the anti imperial struggle and the freedom struggle in India. What really happened was something far more complex because it is the same elite which was educated in English which produced the leaders of the freedom struggle. The greatest example is Gandhi himself, who went to England and then wanted to become an English gentleman earlier, and then we know the familiar story of how it took a lot of effort on the part of Gandhi to move away from this framework of dependence on the West and the veneration, worship of the modern European machine civilization. And then it was followed by his own struggles in South Africa before he came to India. So, all the stalwart leaders of the Indian freedom struggle, they belong to the English educated elite of India. There may be exceptions, and we also know that with the entry of Gandhi into Indian freedom struggle, a large mass base was created with millions of illiterate Indians from the peasant classes also joining the freedom struggle. But all said and done, the leadership was vested with the English educated middle class, and then um, this I would say is also a form of empowerment. It's a political empowerment. If English was until then, until the consolidation of the freedom struggle, was seen as a language of opportunity and power and employment. During the freedom struggle, the same language becomes a language of empowerment in a sense. It creates a political consciousness, it creates the idea of the nation, and it also creates these many philosophies of anti-imperial struggle, the greatest of them being what is embodied in the Hind Swaraj by Mahatma Gandhi. Then it also becomes the language of struggle for B.R. Ambedkar, and that has to be remembered. The Dalit communities in India saw English as the language of emancipation. First of all, they felt that this was one language which was not colored by caste and Varna hierarchies, and it was a language of modernity, and they thought that modernity would at least diminish the power of the caste hierarchies, and it would also probably relieve them of this burden of being called untouchables during that period. No wonder one of the greatest scholars of that time, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, used English as far powerfully as Gandhi did. And he, of course, made use of his own mother tongue, and he would speak to mass movements, but he was trained in the best universities in USA and England, and also he did a diploma in Germany. So um, the point I am trying to make is that on the one hand, English becomes a language of a political empowerment, supporting the freedom struggle in India. On the other hand, the depressed classes, as they were known at that time, they begin to see English as one of the tools or one of the means of finding social emancipation. Even then, English remains the language of empowerment, though for very different purposes. And these two trajectories, I think, moved forward. Um, Nehru and number of them, Rajaji, they were all, very powerful communicators in the English language, but they used it in order to wage a very powerful anti-imperial struggle against the British. It's almost, I mean, uh, if one remembers the post-colonial theories of M.S. Césaire and others, it's like a Caliban learning language from Prospero and using that language to curse Prospero in. Uh, this happened in one of the trajectories, and the other was to seek social emancipation from the orthodoxy and from the local hierarchies of caste and varna through English. And that's the reason why the anti-imperial struggle did not mean a rejection of the English language. It was more like discovering the more potential energies of the English language and employing them for very different historical and political purposes. Um, Now, when we come to the post-colonial phase, with the receding of the imperial British, uh, what happened to the status of the English language? Historians tell us that two factors supported the continuation of English uh, with the same status of power. One was that the elite, which not only participated in the freedom struggle but was also part of the administrative machinery, was English educated. It had carried out its tasks by using the English language, and this had to continue when the new nation was born. One could not create a bureaucracy and a legal system from the scratch. Therefore, the power of English continued even um, with the end of the freedom struggle and the independence of India. This is one of the important factors according to the historians. The other was that here was a new nation in the making, and there were immense opportunities for individuals to seek power of many kinds. Not only from the wealth that was being created, of course, with many odds against that attempt, or the political power which was visibly there, and English was found to be one of the keys that would open the doors of power even in post-independence India, and it continued. The other was that this somehow became, the issue of English became entangled with the question of the national language, because the new nation with a new constitution was trying to evolve a consensus on what would be the lingua franca, what would be the language through which Indians would communicate to each other, and what would be um, the national language. And it was found that there could not be any consensus because many of the South Indian states were not willing to accept Hindi as the national language, and that conflict continues even now. And therefore, English had to continue here. If you look at the official records, you find that the resolutions made are, for the time being, English will continue, or it will continue for maybe the next 10 to 15 years, or the states may continue to use English. These are the kinds of statements you find in our official documents, and all of them point towards the fact that there was no replacement for English despite the development of the bhashas, despite all the support that was given by the state to the development of the bhashas here, English continued to dominate. And the sociological factors are very easy to understand, that there was on the one hand an ever expanding middle class which was taking advantage of the expanding educational system here, and it found that there was no way in which the medium of instruction in the higher educational institutions like colleges and universities would be the bhashas, it would continue to be English. And then, of course, there was another discourse which supported the power of English. This was the discourse of the language of science and technology. It is even today a consensus that in India, at least, the language of science and technology is and has to be English. Let me clearly state here that this has absolutely no support from either the experts in linguistics or those who have made a study of science, technology in relation to developing societies. But the assumption is, and the powerful discourse is, that there cannot be a replacement for English as far as the language of science and technology is concerned. And when this discourse gets linked to the other discourse, that the only way India can develop, Indian society can develop is through science and technology, one can expect the consequence. And the consequence is that English becomes irreplaceable, English becomes almost inevitable, because we have formulated a form of progress which depends very heavily on science and technology, and we don't even make an intellectual effort to uh, to create science and technologies in our own bhashas. I must introduce here one fact often ignored, and that was during the colonial period itself, in some of the institutions founded soon after the first war of independence, many efforts were made to translate science into the bhashas. This is a history which most people ignore. Very important efforts were made in Delhi College and also in Elphinstone in Bombay to teach the sciences in the vernacular languages. Unfortunately, that kind of a drive seems to have got lost with the attainment of independence. And this trajectory of equating English with science and technology, it received a powerful boost with the advent of information technology. And now, of course, I think we all have started agreeing to a discourse that the only science and technology which can empower our economic growth is information technology. I have no time to go into the many more discourses about this technology itself. I'm only pointing out that this earlier equation of English equals science and technology now gets reformulated as English equals information technology, which is in a way true because this technology is now a massive, huge global power in itself, and therefore there is no way in which any society can try to isolate itself from either its use or its influence. And it's very clear that for a long time from now onwards, it will be a unidirectional idea of progress through information technology, through the creation of what is known as a knowledge economy or a knowledge society. And as long as that continues, the vehicle for all this would be English. I mean, as we believe in it, and therefore the domination would continue. Now, we have been talking so far about the empowerment that English brings. We should also see it as a language which leads to deprivation and disempowerment. is very, very essential, absolutely essential for us to understand that there is an equally important, significant trajectory in which the phenomenon of English has grown, and this is the way it has also been disempowering. By disempowering, I mean by creating a very huge divide between those who know English and those who do not know English. It's very unfortunate that something that could have been used for um, the overall empowerment of society, I mean, namely English language, um, becomes the great divider because it causes this cultural and political and all kinds of divide between communities, people who know English and those who do not know English, and that creates a sense of social insecurity where we find parents and people from rural societies demanding English and demanding the medium of English even in the primary schools. So that demand itself is an expression of the disempowerment which English caused in our uh, communities, in our people. That needs to be understood in the sense, on the one hand, it led to English led to what should be described as elitism, the cultural power associated with political power also of a minority of people who use this language of power. That is one of the aspects of this disempowerment, because it also means that the majority of the people who may not use English are kept out of the corridors of power. This is one thing that we need to know. The other is the way in which the Indian middle class has been expanding. In my view, this is an extraordinary historical phenomenon in the modern world. And if you look at the constitution of the class, who belong to it and who do not belong to it, now you will see that English again is one of the important factors. Will this lead to another kind of disempowerment, the disempowerment of the bhashas? Would that happen? Well, there are two issues I can only place before you. One is that in reality, the bhashas energized themselves by uh, understanding, I mean, by responding to English literature. We know that most of the Renaissance movements in our bhashas, in Kannada, Bengali, Marathi, etc., happened because of the intimate encounter with English literature and world literature through the English language. But when we are in a post colonial condition and we find that there is a huge global market economy which empowers English and English alone, there is a definite threat to the bhashas, and the empowerment through English can also mean the disempowerment of these bhashas, which, as Professor Anantamurthy feared, might lead to a situation where the bhasha is only spoken in the kitchen or in the backyard, and that bhasha may no longer be a language of knowledge and power. I don't see such an immediate threat, but there is a possibility. The possibility that there will be a continued disempowerment of the bhashas, of the dialects of these bhashas because of the domination of the English language. At the same time, we should also understand that when certain historical factors lead to the power of a language, perhaps there is no way in which you can escape it. Rather, you should you should make every effort to democratize it, make every effort to make an equal distribution of the power that it may bring. And this can happen only when we have a good pedagogical system of teaching and learning. My own take on the entire issue is that because we have failed to create the proper modes of teaching English language, I'm not talking about literature, um, this has led to number of conflicts which could have otherwise been avoided. I mean, if there was a possibility of the of the Indian educational system taking over the task of teaching this language along with the bhashas, maybe without a hierarchy, then I'm sure most of the communities kept out of the power of English would have learned to use English for democratization, for a more egalitarian participation in the entire society. Therefore, I would say that my argument is this, that if we look at the entire historical cultural landscape from the entry of English into India to the contemporary situation, it presents us with this kind of an ambivalence where it provides empowerment but it also brings about disempowerment. It's not the language that has to be blamed. I began by saying that from a linguistic point of view, every language is a self-sufficient system. There are no rich languages and poor languages. All languages satisfy the needs of the communities in which they are spoken. And therefore, English is now performing all these functions because of the kind of history that we have gone through, not because there is anything inherently so powerful about that language. Therefore, considering the whole hinterland of our own history, our own colonial past, and our global present now, I think we need to be very objective in assessing the power of English, and more importantly, on how people perceive English. As students today who are familiar with cultural studies, we should expand the approaches that we have towards the understanding of English and empowerment, and we should also bring in this important element of how do the communities in a nation and society perceive English, not what it is, but how it is perceived. This will help us to understand the conflictual side which English is. Uh, I have always said that English is a very exciting cultural site, mainly because it's very conflictual. There are no ready-made, easy solutions and answers. Um, that I think is where we should be moving. I would like to conclude by saying that many of the things we now say about English are true of the information technology also. Information technology can be used for centralizing politics, for dominating over others, for surveillance, and intrusion into our privacies. But it can also be a technology which can democratize knowledge and take knowledge to everybody now, because all those old hierarchies of who owns knowledge have broken down, and this is the technology which has made it possible. So just as the same technology can on the one hand lead to loss of our individual freedoms, and also to democratization and democratic struggles, I think English also has this dual potential of empowerment, disempowerment, of gathering up knowledge and handing it over to a small elite, to the opposite, where it can be used by different communities for different social and political purposes. That, friends, is the way I would try to understand the relationship between English and empowerment. I would like to conclude by thanking the host college for organizing this webinar on a very relevant topic. Thank you very much.